Lin Biao had summed up the question of politics with four phrases, the four firsts. He summed it up in essence in regard to the military, but it applies throughout society. As between men and weapons, one must put man in first place. And as between politics and other problems that men face, one puts politics in first place. And as between ordinary political problems and the problems of ideology and political consciousness, one has to put political consciousness and ideology first. And as between the living ideas in people's heads and ideas in books, one has to put the living ideas first. And these are the sort of the summation of the experience of the revolution in China in regard to politics in command. Now, if you think through these four things and look at those two armed forces that clashed in the last few weeks, you can see the truth of this summation. Now, in regard to the economic development of China, this question of technique in command versus politics in command came up in my life experience very early. I remember during some examples from World War II. I was in southwest China during the war, and I worked in a part of the U.S. government service with a man named Gerald Winfield, who was a lively old missionary who had all sorts of solutions for China, all of which were technical. He was a very keen propagandist, and he used to lecture to us. We were all young neophytes, and he was the old China hand, and he used to lecture to us all about what China needed. And in his view, of course, what China needed was fertilizer, insecticides, tractors, electric power, irrigation pumps, science, biology, chemistry, and so on. And that had been his whole work. Actually, I guess professionally he was a parasitologist. Of course, China was a well, he himself, of course, was a parasite, but that isn't what I meant. He had a regular paradise for parasitology out in West China. But of course, all these efforts to modernize China fell afoul of the old society. The semi-feudal colonial economy of China, the political economy of China was such that there was really no way that anyone could modernize it. Certainly not without basic changes. And all these Western experts came in with the idea of modernization. They were going to bring science and all these changes and lift China out of feudalism. But the only techniques they knew, the economic techniques and the scientific techniques, all had to do with capitalism, with the investment of capital, with a commodity market, with loans and credit and interest and so on. And they came into a country where throughout the hinterland there wasn't much of a commodity market, if any commodity market at all. And money wasn't capital in the Chinese hinterland. There was no one who thought in terms of money as an investment. There was no safe way that money could be invested in production. Money was used to buy land. Money was turned into gold and buried in the ground. Money was loaned out to indigent people who either were sick or didn't have enough grain to live till spring, and so on. And it was returned at 100% interest, 200% interest, 300% interest. But none of these forms in any way aided production. It is of no use to bid up the price of land. The land doesn't change one iota from the fact that it was once worth $100 an acre and is now, say, $200 an acre. It didn't make it any more productive. All it implied was that more people were bidding for it. When you loan money to someone who is either because they're sick or they can't live through till spring, and you get 200% back, it is really just, well, you might say it aids production in that it kept a potential producer alive, but of course such a loan did not in any way advance production in any ordinary sense. When you take money and convert it into silver or gold and bury it in the ground, that doesn't aid production either. That simply takes potential capital and turns it into something other than capital, simply inert wealth. And throughout China, throughout the economy of China, where you didn't have capitalist society, you had a feudal, a semi-feudal, semi-colonial society. All these plans for modernization broke on this rock, so that you had a stagnant situation in which not only was production not developing, but production was actually declining. There was enough of a commodity market so that Western textiles, for instance, flooded China and broke up the handcraft production, which had been the employment of a large number of people in the off-season, and you reduced peasants to simply work in crops, and work in crops maybe tied them down 50, 60, 100 days a year, and the rest of the time they simply were idle. So what commodity market did develop only destroyed production, and there was no investment in productivity to take up any slack. We've all heard about how hard-working Chinese peasants are, and indeed, in any job that a Chinese peasant would undertake, the work is tremendously hard. Do you know that the average load on a Chinese wheelbarrow that a man wheels 20 miles a day can be up to half a ton, one man. And if two men are hooked to this wheelbarrow, they can move up to a ton 20 miles a day. You try it sometime. The work is very hard, but the problem was that most people didn't have any such work to do. Most people, fully half or more of the population, had no work to do throughout the winter, and this tremendous potential of human labor was wasted in China before the revolution. And so all these schemes of modernization really only made this situation worse. And what men like Winfield just could not understand was that the problem was one of revolution, of political upheaval, of the change of this whole setup and all these relationships to release the potential forces that were in China. There were hundreds of millions of able-bodied men and women. There were tremendous wealth buried underground. There were, at the time that I worked in China in reclamation of wasteland, there were 300 million acres of wasteland in China that could be reclaimed. And the total crop area of China is only 300 million acres. So there were all of these tremendous resources, labor power, minerals, soil, and so on, but they simply were stagnant because of the feudal land system, the domination of the country by landed gentry, the further domination of the country by imperialism in alliance with landed gentry, which prevented technique from developing, prevented money from being used as capital, and caused it to be buried in the ground. Perhaps you are aware that these sums were enormous. The buried coinage in China was something in the order of $6 billion US. If you know that in India today there is some equivalent sum buried in the ground in countries which are essentially capital poor. They're borrowing money from the U.S. particularly, but there's hundreds of billions of dollars in gold and silver buried in the ground in a country like India and formerly in a country like China that was doing nobody any good. So the goal of the revolution was to break up this system and release these productive forces. And strangely, this is the way dialectical process always works. They release productive forces by and prepared the way for socialism by giving every peasant a private piece of land. You couldn't think of, in a certain way, you couldn't think of a more backward step. Here you have hundreds of millions of semi-proletarian and rural proletarian people, propertyless people who are not particularly tied to private property because they've never had any, and have always, many of them have been in this common pool of labor power. And in order to change the society, the first step is to make everyone a little bourgeois. Give everyone a little piece of land, give everyone a bit of a house, give everyone a leg of a mule at least, and make everyone a bit of a property owner. And this was the first step in the transformation of China, that is the land reform. And land reform was, one could hardly calculate the results on production of this simple step. Simple economically, I mean. It was terribly difficult politically and terribly difficult socially. If anyone is familiar with my book, you'll know it's a 4 to 6 year process just to carry through land reform. But I mean, economically, it's a simple thing. You simply take what a few held and give everyone a share of it, or rather people themselves take what a few held and divide it among them. And to hear it from these American experts, this couldn't possibly do any good. Winfield, for instance, land reform, what's that? Is there going to be any more land when we're done? No. Is there going to be any more capital when it's done? No. Is there going to be any more fertilizer, insecticides, any more science, technique? No. So what good is land reform, says Winfield. We argued this out back in Chongqing, 45. I used to argue this out with Winfield. He couldn't see what on earth is this land reform all about. What are these communists up to? Trying to divide all this property. It's nothing but the distribution of poverty. Well, the question of how can just dividing up these small plots of land change the situation in a huge nation with the largest population in the world and release these productive forces that are latent? Well, it does it in a variety of ways. You see, when you have a landlord and you have a tenant, the landlord's only object is to get as much rent as he can, and in a pre-capitalist society, He's not about to invest. He can't invest in production. As I said, he could buy more land, but he could certainly not buy some machinery. First place, someone would probably steal it or steal all the movable parts off it before he even got it home. That's the experience we had taking tractors to China in the Guomindang areas. We couldn't even get them from the seaport to the wasteland because by the time we got there, the wheels were gone, the spark plugs were gone, the tires were gone, and so on. You know, he couldn't possibly make this kind of investment. All he can do is demand a big rent and make sure that he collects it, and then he cheats in the collection of it. You know. Well, once the land belongs to the tiller, once the peasant gets his land, then the whole thing changes. He's very anxious to invest in this production because by putting in some extra effort, he can win an increased return. And this changes the whole attitude. A tenant isn't going to work very hard. It's certainly not going to work to improve anything because he can't. He may be kicked off the plot next year, and someone else will get the benefit. Or if he improves production, the landlord's only going to take a bigger rent. The tenant is not going to improve things, and the landlord is not going to improve things. So here you have stagnation. But once the land is divided, and everyone gets a relatively equal share, the whole attitude toward production changes, and since what is grown benefits the tiller, all sorts of ideas for improvement, all sorts of investment immediately appear, and things begin to change very rapidly. Among the things that change is that the buried gold and silver comes out of the ground. When you take a landlord that's never done any work, and he's always lived off rents, and you give him an equal share, he gets a couple of acres, and if he's to eat, he has to go and work. One of the first things he does is dig up his gold and silver. And since, under the new democratic laws of China, capital investment was encouraged, he's liable to invest that, either in his farming or in something else. So, on land reform, not only do hundreds of millions of peasants suddenly find it important to increase production, but landlords pull the capital, former landlords pull the capital out of the ground and start investing it. Labor very quickly becomes more productive for things that you wouldn't even think of. Like under the old society, where everyone's on the ragged edge of poverty, many people are landless, many people are beggars, many people are bandits, the majority of people are thieves, they have to be. When the crops get ripe, everyone has to send at least one or two family members to live in the field day and night. They cannot leave the ripening crops because if they leave them for a moment, someone else will harvest them. You come in the morning and your grain is gone. And you understand that you rent scattered plots. You don't have all your wheat, say, right here in front of you. Dad's got to watch the big piece, and the son's got to watch the other piece, and the wife's got to watch the other piece, and they build little galiang stock tents in the field. Anything for cover. And they got to stay, rain or shine, day or night, they got to sleep there, eat there, sit there, just to make sure that when harvest time comes, there's something to harvest. As soon as land reform occurred, everyone had their own land. Who's thinking of stealing someone else's crops? You're busy raising your own. And this whole question of guarding it just simply disappeared. It wasn't an issue anymore. Here you save God knows what endless hours of watching and so on. Little things like this increased production and gave people extra labor power. But obviously, it's the release of production through the private holding of small plots and through land reform has certain limits because it changes the motivation of people, it releases certain productive forces, it helps people overcome problems like having to watch their crops day and night, but it has limits in terms of the small scale of the production, the lack of capital, the number of days that people can work on their own land goes up because they make minor improvements, and in the off-season they can work at it, but still there's heavy unemployment in the winter, nothing to do, and land reform is only sort of lays the groundwork for putting China to work, developing the economy. It doesn't solve the problem beyond a certain point. Then the question is, how is this society going to develop? In what way, what economic forces, what political and social forces are going to be brought to bear to develop the potential that's there? In China, you had this choice of road, which would have meant very slow increases in production and the bankruptcy of most people. Or you had the choice of a cooperative road, which could really release the potential of the people very quickly. And the Chinese peasants chose the cooperative road. It began with mutual aid. You have a few scattered plots of ground and you share a donkey with 4 or 5 families. You probably don't own a cart, but maybe one of your neighbors may own a cart and doesn't have a donkey or a mule. You begin to pool these things and immediately increase production. Furthermore, by pooling, you can get together enough capital to enter some winter production. Alone, you couldn't possibly even make bean curd out of beans, but 4 or 5 families together, 8 or 10 families together, can pool enough resources to set up a small bean curd plant, or a small ink-making plant, or a small dye-making plant, or whatever. Or they can pool mules and carts and transport coal, or some sort of thing. And immediately, the average day's work jumps 10, 20 days a year. Through this cooperative road, you can make steady progress in production and in transforming society and transforming nature. So what was only a partial liberation of forces through land reform becomes an increasingly effective liberation of productive forces through cooperation and collectivization. Each stage creates problems of its own, and at each stage, the people involved have to make a decision to go forward or forget about collective production. For instance, the mutual aid stage is a very difficult one, because though there's great advantage in working together, since your property is private and the returns are private, there are many conflicts of interest. For instance, in the North China Plain and in the mountains of North China, the soil is impoverished and low in organic matter because people have had to burn not only the straw but the roots of the plants they've raised over 1,000 years or more. So there's almost no organic matter in the soil, and when it rains, the soil's soft mud that bogs everything down, but as soon as the sun comes out, it turns hard like concrete. Now, you have some crops growing there, and it rains. It's important to go out and hoe while the ground is soft. And furthermore, it's important to get the plants while they're small and the ground is soft, because within a few days, number one, the ground gets hard as concrete. Number two, the water spurts the growth of the weeds. And if you wait, you're going to get much more difficulty. So it rains, and everyone wants the group to come to his field first. And there can be quarrels about this. Even if you agree, set up some order of priority, and turn about and take turns, the weather doesn't always cooperate. And maybe it doesn't rain as often as it should. Or maybe it doesn't rain at all. And so on. All kinds of conflicts arise at a low level of cooperation, and mutual aid is not a very stable kind of collective work. To solve these problems, you can either forget about it and we'll each go on our own, which doesn't work too well either when you only have an acre or two scattered in 15 places, or you can raise the level of cooperation to pool land. And once you pool land and you farm it jointly, it doesn't matter which field you hoe first, because you're all sharing from all the fields. So the problems that arise are resolved through raising the level of cooperation. But the Chinese peasants could not just establish full-fledged collective agriculture in one step. Property, of course, meant a great deal to each family, and they couldn't just pool it and forget whose field was whose, even though they might share the produce all around. So the original cooperatives, they held the land as capital shares, and their labor went in as labor days recorded, and then when it came time to share the crop, it was shared in part according to how much land you put in, and in part according to how much labor you put in. So this raised a whole new level of problems, because after a year or two, it's quite obvious as yields improve that it's the labor of the able-bodied young people particularly who are doing most of the labor that's causing living to improve. And they begin to resent the heavy capital share going to families who perhaps don't have any labor power anymore, who once put in a fair amount of land but aren't contributing. So conflicts arise at this level, and they're resolved then by usually through democratic discussion and voting, by cutting down the capital share and increasing the labor share. And so a sort of primitive cooperative farm is gradually transformed into a higher level, to a collective farm in which no capital shares are recorded anymore. The land is pooled, the deeds are burned, you own everything in common, and you share according to work, not original investment. To resolve those conflicts, then, you move to a higher level still. And this higher level enables you to much more rationally use labor power, use land, mobilize for winter work, set up small industries, set up a village school, even a high school maybe, and so on. Once you build a cooperative of that kind, the productive power is much stronger. And then you find the average Chinese peasant, once they reach this stage, the average Chinese peasant is working 150, 160, maybe 200 days a year, which is an extraordinary, well, you might say, doubling of the labor power applied to the land and to the resources. If you realize that capital is nothing but congealed labor power, you can see that China's capital doubles when the capital available doubles when people work twice as much, and it's particularly when much of this winter work is put into capital construction, like irrigation systems or whatever. But these what they call fully socialist co-ops, what in Russia they call collective farms, also raise problems, particularly externally, because they're like 100 families, 150 families. They farm maybe 1,000 acres, 500 acres, but really not a very big area. And they run into conflicts. If you want to bring water, then your neighbor's cooperative they got to lose land. You want to plant trees on the mountain, but the other co-op wants to pasture goats on the mountain. And of course the goats destroy the trees. There are many technical problems that arise from the small scale of the cooperatives that originally arose in China. Perhaps you may realize that North China is a very barren country. I described it in my book, but it really used to be like a landscape on the moon. The only trees that you saw were behind the walls of village homes. no tree out in the open could survive because someone's goat or sheep would nip it off as soon as it came out of the ground. And there were no forests, or let's say there were only maybe one or two forests left in all of North China. One of them was northwest of Yan'an, an area of a few thousand acres that still had forest trees growing. It was such a phenomena that it was famous all over North China for the fact there's a forest there near Yan'an. There were no other forests anywhere outside of the mountains of Manchuria, which were way off in the other direction. But this was in a country that had originally been heavily forested. It's not that trees won't grow there. It had originally been heavily forested, but the trees had been cut down for construction and for agriculture, and then grazing had prevented their regrowth for 1,000, 2,000 years. And it was impossible to change this even with the cooperative agriculture because no group controlled enough area to prevent random grazing and so on. And such factors as these caused the growth of the commune movement. From an economic point of view, it was important that small cooperatives band together and jointly manage large areas. Areas of several square miles or many square miles where mountains and valleys and the whole ecology could be planned and used to the greatest advantage. By getting together in this way, the problems of irrigation were solved. Whose land to dig up didn't matter because you were part of a single organization, and within this organization you could be compensated for losing land here, get land there, and so on. Mountains could be set aside, and because you're all one organization, one can coordinate where the sheep and goats will graze, and so trees that are planted can grow. The underground resources can then be developed. You have strength enough to open things like iron mines, even drill deep wells and all sorts of things, so that by this larger scale of cooperation, one develops productive forces further. And through this development, the labor is more completely used, so that with the commune phase of agriculture in China, the average peasant is working 250, many people up to 300 days a year. And you might say, is this progress? It's better to work 50 or 60. Well, it would be maybe under American conditions, particularly if you can rip off a livelihood like some of our friends. But if working 50, 60 days a year means you starve the rest of the year, it's a terrible fix. And by reorganizing the whole economy, the relations of production, the productive forces, so that labor power can be applied rationally to the resources that are there, it means tremendous progress for a people, and it means the liberation of the productive forces in the country. So that has essentially been the story in agriculture. It's not, the key has not been modernization, the application of modern technique. The key has been the reorganization of society, the change in the relation between men and men, and in a collective direction. This has enabled the people, the country people of China, the rural people, to begin to apply modern techniques, to apply science, to apply mechanization, to use electric power, to develop the resources, say for pumping, and to actually make and use pumps and so on. The heart of the matter is changing the relations of production. The heart of the matter is political, not technical. And in the wake of political change, the technical changes follow. And this is been summed up by Mao in relation to Chinese farming as collectivization must precede mechanization. Now, this didn't come without a great deal of struggle. There were people in China who thought just the opposite. They thought mechanization must precede collectivization. The proponent of this line was essentially Liu Shaoqi, who was the target of struggle in the Cultural Revolution. And his whole thesis was essentially a thesis of modernization of technique and command, and it was applied in every field. And his idea in agriculture was that it makes no use to change the relations of production until you have modern industry, machines, electricity, fertilizers, insecticides, science developed by the society as a whole, and then one can talk about land pooling, large-scale agriculture, and change. Before this is available, one must simply have laissez-faire and let people enrich themselves as best they can, and have a basic structure of 4 freedoms. The 4 freedoms of capitalism are the freedom to buy and sell land, the freedom to hire labor for wages, the freedom to loan money at interest, and the freedom to set up individual private enterprises. Liu's idea was that these were necessary for an extended period, and when industry developed to the point of large-scale mechanization, then one could have a socialist revolution in the countryside. Of course, if his line had been followed, you would not be in any position, really, today to mechanize agriculture in China. You'd have a class of rich peasants or kulaks in the Chinese countryside who dominate the economy, but still were not big enough to use machinery. They might have 2 or 3 times the land of their neighbors, but what kind of scale would that be? When the average farmer in North China holding is 5 acres, so these kulaks would have 15, and you can't mechanize on the basis of 15 acres. So this question of mechanization before collectivization is simply a dream. It's not related to reality, certainly not to the reality of China. Now, it's true that in America we had mechanization without collectivization, and it's proceeding at a rapid pace to the point of driving me, as well as many other farmers, off the land or nearly so. Now, these same problems apply in every sphere, and industry, education, military, wherever you look, the heart of the matter in building a socialist society and carrying through a socialist revolution is the question of politics in command, of transforming of relations between people, transforming ideology, transforming consciousness, and in the wake of this transformation, releasing the energy that has developed technique, applied technique, transformed nature, and so on. The evidence is overwhelming. One of the, of course, the average response to this here in the West is that you can't build a society that way. That really an industrial, modern, productive society can only take one form. That is the capitalist form, and that this is a form that suits that's related to human nature. That men left to their own devices, freed from constraints, will build capitalism. It's very hard with this point of view to understand how feudalism ever developed. because it existed a lot before capitalism and for a lot longer time than capitalism in the world. But, you know, the early bourgeois revolutionaries considered feudalism to be a very unnatural system. The attack on it was that it wasn't in accord with human nature, that it constrained people and confined people and prevented people from doing what they ought to do as human beings, which is to enrich themselves. It put roadblocks in the way, and out of this arose the whole concept of bourgeois right. Now, what is the concept? Bourgeois right is essentially to free the laborer from feudal constraint, to free him from any ties to the estate, and to place him on the market with nothing to sell but his labor power. You know, this is what bourgeois right means for the majority of people. It means that everyone meets equally in the marketplace. I come trotting along to sell my hands, and Mr. Rockefeller is there to hire them. And this is an equal relationship of bourgeois right. We're both free to do the best we can, to make the best bargain we can in the marketplace. And that was the original goal of the bourgeois revolution. And under these slogans, they smashed feudal constraint and they liberated the people from all means of production and from all security and from all ties, and they placed them by the millions as people who had nothing to sell but their hands, the labor of their hands. And this was, of course, a great step in the development of the world, but it had very serious consequences, which we're seeing today, and that's why socialist revolution exists. So, in the development of socialism, though, all these assumptions that capitalism reflects human nature and that the only way to develop productive forces is to free people from all property and place them in the marketplace to meet Mr. Rockefeller on an equal basis, all of these theories are challenged. Socialist revolutionaries don't accept any part of it. In fact, one of the goals of revolution in China is to do away with bourgeois right and establish a system of socialist right. And along with doing away with bourgeois right, we do away with the difference between town and country, the difference between mental and manual labor, and create an entirely new world that is in which people are really equal and not just equal in the marketplace. Now, this whole question has meant that in China, they take these goals seriously. The goal of doing away with the difference between town and country, and the goal of doing away with the difference between mental and manual labor is taken seriously in China. It doesn't mean that you merge town and country, but it means that productivity, culture, science, technique is as high in the countryside as it is in the city. It means that the rewards of labor are as high in the countryside as in the city. It means that opportunity, these are goals. These have not been reached, but the goal is that opportunities would be as great in the countryside as in the city, and so on. And between mental and manual labor, it doesn't mean that picking up a rock is the same thing as considering a problem. But it means that people who, first place, it means that the masses of people would be developed to do both to consider a problem and to pick up rocks, and that they would develop this potential universally, and that the prestige of thinking through a thought and picking up a rock would be equal, and that the rewards would essentially be equal. And this is what is meant by doing away with the difference between mental and manual labor. This is an socialist revolutionaries take these problems seriously. Therefore, you have in China what Gurley, the Stanford economist, has called building on the worst. Any capitalist knows you can't do that. A capitalist always builds on the best. He looks over the country, he makes a survey, he gets an economist in, not a political economist, but an economist. He gets an economist in, and he makes a market survey, and he decides to locate his factory where? Well, where it's linked most cheaply to all other factories and to sources of raw material, where it's most advantageous in relation to the market, where he can hire the most skilled labor at the lowest rates, and so on and so on and so on. And he absolutely is interested in the best. Nothing but the best will do. And there he builds his factory, which means that he builds his factory next door to the next factory, and development of a huge city which essentially drains and lives off the countryside. But in China, they build on the worst, which means that they consider that true economic development is the development of the full potential of the whole population and the whole country. Therefore, you don't just build a factory where you can make the most immediate profit, but you put the factory way out in the hinterland because industry is needed in every area, and raw materials are available in distant places, and people, peasants are there to develop industry and train themselves and develop in all sorts of distant places, and you take the material available and you build to bring up the whole country together and to bring the countryside up at the same time as the city, and tend to have a balanced development of the whole economy. So in a sense, you build on the worst for a considerable period, and of course capitalists know you can't do that. It's not economic, it's Maoist irrationalism, Maoist fanaticism is what it is. But it's obvious that in the long run, and not too long run at that, the potential of such an economic development is way beyond that capitalism has ever known, because there's an iron law, basic law of capitalism of uneven development, which leads not only to the bankruptcy and destruction of large areas of the world and of the people, but leads to crisis, war, and everything else that so threatens us today, in contrast to this idea of, as Gurley says, building on the worst, that would lead to the balanced development of a whole society in which people are equipped both for mental and manual work, develop their full potential in every line, and no one is left out and no one is left behind.